Emma's fingers stayed locked around the steering wheel long after the engine quit. The farmhouse ahead looked smaller than her grief. Paint faded, porch sinking, every board holding the weight of what Will left unsaid. Behind her, Noah and Lily bounced in their seats, calling it an adventure, believing home was a promise. Emma forced a smile until a deep thump sounded above. Dust drifted from the eaves. She looked up and saw a man crouched on the roof, staring down like he'd been waiting. Why was a stranger standing between her family and the only place they had left? To keep stories like this coming, please subscribe to the channel and help us reach the 1,000 subscribers the platform requires. Your support lets us keep sharing emotional, suspenseful journeys like Emma's. Emma kept both hands on the wheel after the engine died, listening to the ticking of heat fading from the hood. The farmhouse waited at the end of a cracked driveway, smaller than she remembered, its white paint dulled by years of sun and rain. Weeds pushed up along the porch steps, and one shutter hung crooked, tapping softly against the siding. This was the only roof left to her, willed down through family and finally landing in her lap like a stone. Since Will's funeral, life had become a series of humiliations that arrived in envelopes, late fees, final notices, polite words that still meant no. Emma had worked, skipped meals, and sold anything that felt like a luxury, yet the numbers never stopped climbing. She hadn't told the kids how close they'd come to sleeping in the car for good. She only told them they were going home, because children deserved at least one word that sounded safe. Noah, 7, jumped out as soon as she unlocked the doors, his breath puffing in the cold. Lily, 5, followed with her stuffed bunny tucked under one arm, boots thumping on the gravel. They dashed toward the porch, laughing at the way their footsteps echoed under the overhang. Emma hurried after them, forcing her legs to move faster than her worry. Then a heavy thud landed from above, too solid to be a squirrel, and too close to be a branch falling in the yard. Dust sifted from the eaves and drifted in the slanting light. Emma stopped mid-step, her stomach tightening as the sound rolled through the house frame. A second noise came, shingles scraping, followed by a faint, strained creak. "Back to me now." Emma's voice cut the air, calm on purpose. Noah turned, startled, and Lily's smile faded as she read the urgency on her mother's face. Emma gathered them in, one arm around each small shoulder, and backed them away from the steps. She placed herself between the porch and her children the way she had learned to do since Will died. Body first, fear later. She looked up. A man crouched near the roof edge, close enough that she could see the dirt on his gloves. He wore a worn cap and a jacket stained with honest work, but his eyes were fixed on the roof boards as if they were counting down. When he noticed the children, he lifted one hand, palm out, not like a threat but like a warning sign planted in the ground. "Ma'am," he called, keeping his voice low, "please, keep them back. Don't go inside." He didn't ask for anything else, didn't even climb down. He simply stayed braced, careful with his weight. Emma's mind raced through every story she'd ever heard about isolated houses and people who took advantage of desperation. Still, the man's expression held something different from hunger or anger. Guilt, sharp and immediate. Emma steered the kids toward the car, gravel crunching under their shoes, and stopped with the hood between them and the porch. Noah pressed his hands to the window glass, eyes wide, while Lily hugged her bunny so tightly its ears bent. Emma kept her own hands visible, even as her pulse hammered, refusing to give the stranger a reason to think she would rush him. "Who are you?" she asked. "Mark," he answered. "I live nearby." He swallowed, glancing at the same section of roof again, then back at Emma, as if pleading for her to believe him. "I'm not here to hurt you." Emma wanted to demand proof, to call someone, to do anything that would make her feel less trapped by bad choices and bad timing. Her phone showed almost no signal, and the road behind them was already darkening into a narrow ribbon between fields. The house behind Mark looked harmless from a distance, yet the earlier thud still rang in her ears, and the dust in her throat tasted like warning. She studied the porch posts, the sagging gutter, the tired lines of the roof, details she'd been too exhausted to notice until fear sharpened them. She remembered Will's last week, how he'd apologized for leaving problems behind, how he'd insisted the kids deserved walls, not pity. Emma had thought he meant money. Now, with a stranger balancing overhead, she wondered what secret Will had carried into the grave and why nobody had warned her. "Why are you up there?" she said louder now, so the kids would hear confidence even if she didn't feel it. Mark's jaw tightened, and for a moment he stared past her, toward the side window where a bedroom curtain hung half-closed. "Because it isn't safe," he said, "and you're about to put your family right under it." A small crack snapped through the evening, clean as a stick breaking over a knee. Mark went still, spreading his fingers on the shingles as if he could hold the whole roof in place by will alone. Emma pulled Noah and Lily another step back until the car door touched her hip, and she kept her eyes on the roofline. Mark's voice dropped to something almost swallowed by the settling house. "There isn't much time," he said. Mark moved with the caution of someone handling explosives. He eased himself backward along the ridgeline, boots finding purchase on shingles that groaned under even his careful weight. Emma watched every shift, every pause, her mind split between wanting him gone and needing to understand why he'd come at all. Noah whispered something to Lily, and she shushed him with a hand over his mouth, eyes never leaving the roof. When Mark finally reached the ladder propped against the side of the house, he descended rung by rung, testing each one before trusting it with his full weight. His boots hit the ground with a soft thud, and he stood there for a moment, wiping his palms on his jeans as if preparing to say something he'd rehearsed 100 times and still didn't know how to deliver. Emma kept the car between them. "You need to leave," she said, though her voice lacked the force she intended. Mark nodded slowly, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, like he'd expected her to say exactly that. "I will," he said. "But first you need to know what's up there." He pointed to the section of roof directly above the front bedroom, the one with the window Emma had already mentally assigned to the kids because it faced the sunrise and had space for both their beds. Mark's hand didn't waver. "That whole section is rotted through," he said. "The beams underneath are split, and the only thing holding it up is stubbornness and luck. If you put weight on the floor below it, furniture, people, anything, it's going to come down." Emma felt the words land like cold water. She looked at the house, trying to see what he saw, but from the ground everything appeared ordinary, tired but standing. "How do you know?" she asked, and the question came out sharper than she meant, edged with all the frustration of a woman who'd been lied to, abandoned, and left holding pieces she didn't know how to fit together. Mark's shoulders sagged. "Because your husband told me." The silence that followed was so complete, Emma could hear the wind moving through the dry grass in the field beyond the driveway. Noah shifted behind the car window, his breath fogging the glass. Lily's bunny slipped from her arms and landed on the seat, forgotten. "Will came to see me last spring," Mark continued, his voice low and strained. "He showed up at my place one evening, said he needed help but didn't have money to pay for it. He told me the roof was bad, that he was afraid something would happen to the kids if he didn't fix it soon. I told him I'd come by the next week, that we'd figure it out together." Emma's throat tightened. She hadn't known. Will had carried so much in silence, shouldering burdens he thought were his alone, and she'd been too busy keeping the lights on and food on the table to notice the weight bending him. "Why didn't you come?" she asked, and the question held no anger, only exhaustion. Mark's jaw worked. "I got busy, harvest season hit, equipment broke down, and I kept telling myself I'd get to it next week, then the week after. I convinced myself it wasn't urgent, that Will was just being cautious." He looked down at his boots, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked. "Then I heard he'd passed. I came by a few days after the funeral, but the house was empty. I thought maybe you'd sold it, moved on. I kept checking, and tonight I saw the car pull up." Emma pressed her palm to the car hood, needing something solid to hold her upright. Will had asked for help, and help had promised to come, but never did. He'd died carrying that worry, and now she stood in the same spot, inheriting not just the house but the danger he'd tried to prevent. The injustice of it burned in her chest, that a good man could do everything right, ask for what he needed, and still be failed by a world that moved too slow for people without safety nets. Mark took a half step forward, then stopped when Emma's posture stiffened. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I'm asking you to keep your kids out of that house tonight. The bedroom especially. I came up here to assess it, and it's worse than I thought. If you'd put them to bed in there..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Emma turned to look at Noah and Lily through the car window. They sat close together now, Lily's head resting on her brother's shoulder, both of them watching her with the kind of trust that made her chest ache. She'd driven for hours to bring them here, promising safety and a fresh start, and now a stranger was telling her the only home she had left was a trap waiting to spring. "Where are we supposed to go?" she asked, and the question wasn't rhetorical. She genuinely didn't know. The motel 2 towns over would cost money she didn't have, and the nearest relative lived states away and hadn't returned her calls since the funeral. Mark seemed to understand the weight of what he was asking. "There's a barn on my property," he offered carefully. "It's clean, insulated, has a wood stove. You and the kids can stay there tonight while I figure out how to stabilize the roof." Emma wanted to laugh at the absurdity. A widow and her children sleeping in a stranger's barn like something out of a folk tale. But when she looked back at the house, at the sagging roofline and the shadows pooling under the eaves, she felt the truth settle in her bones. Mark wasn't lying. Will had known, had tried to fix it, and now the danger her husband feared had outlived him. A gust of wind pushed through the yard, rattling the loose shutter and carrying the scent of rain. Emma opened the car door and crouched beside Noah and Lily, smoothing Lily's hair and squeezing Noah's hand. "We're going to stay somewhere else tonight," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Just for a little while." Noah frowned. "But you said this was home." Emma swallowed hard. "It will be," she promised, praying it wasn't another lie. "We just need to make it safe first." Mark stepped back, giving them space, but his eyes stayed on the roof, as if he expected it to collapse right then and prove him right. Emma gathered what little they'd unpacked, locked the car, and followed him down the driveway as the last light bled from the sky. Behind them, the house stood silent and still, holding its breath. What none of them saw was the thin crack spreading along the ridgeline, barely visible in the growing dark, widening with every shift of the wind. Emma guided the children into Mark's barn with a flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, the scent of hay and old wood wrapping around them. It was cleaner than she expected, swept floors, a sturdy loft, and a cast-iron stove in the corner that Mark immediately knelt to light. Noah and Lily hesitated near the door, clutching their few belongings, eyes wide in the flickering shadows. This wasn't the homecoming Emma had promised, but as warmth began to radiate from the stove, the tension in her shoulders loosened just enough to breathe. Mark worked quickly, setting up cot beds with thick blankets he pulled from a cedar chest. He didn't speak much, just moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years spent fixing things. When he finished, he stood back, wiping soot from his hands. "It's not much," he said, his voice rough, "but it's dry, and it's safe." He looked at Emma, and for the first time, she saw the weight of his own regret in the lines of his face, the knowledge that he was offering shelter now because he hadn't offered help then. After the children were settled, tucked under heavy quilts with the glow of the stove painting their faces in soft orange light, Emma stepped outside with Mark. The night air bit at her skin, a sharp contrast to the barn's warmth. They stood in the gravel driveway, the farmhouse a dark silhouette in the distance. "Tell me," Emma said, her arms crossed tight against the chill. "Tell me exactly what Will said." Mark looked toward the house, his expression pained. "He didn't want you to worry," he began. "That was the main thing. He came to me late one night, about a week before he died. Said he'd found rot in the main support beam above the kids' room. He'd tried to patch it himself, but the wood was too far gone." Mark paused, kicking at a loose stone. "He was scared, Emma, really scared. Not for himself, but for them. He made me promise I wouldn't tell you how bad it was until we fixed it." Emma felt tears prick her eyes, hot and sudden. Will had always been like that, protecting her from the hard truths, carrying the heavy things so she wouldn't have to. She'd thought his distance in those final weeks was stress about money, about losing his job. Now she knew it was this, a silent, desperate race against a crumbling house he couldn't afford to save. "And you promised," she whispered. "I did," Mark said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I told him I'd come over with my tools and some lumber I had left over. We set a date. Then, life got in the way. My tractor blew a gasket. I had a sick cow, and I pushed it back. I called him to reschedule, and he said it was okay that the roof was holding for now. Mark looked at her, eyes pleading. I didn't know he was sick. I didn't know he'd be gone before I could get there. The unfairness of it struck Emma like a physical blow. A man who asked for help, a friend who meant well but got busy, and a house that waited, quietly rotting, while a family broke apart. It was a tragedy of small moments, of missed chances and silent burdens. She looked at the farmhouse, now just a shadow against the stars, and imagined Will up there in the dark, trying to hold his world together, with nothing but love and a hammer. "He never told me," Emma said, her voice trembling. "He let me think everything was fine. He let me believe we were safe." She wiped her eyes angrily. "He should have told me." "He wanted to fix it first," Mark said gently. "He wanted to be the one to make it right." They stood in silence for a long moment, the wind sighing through the trees. Then a sound cut through the night, a low, grinding groan that seemed to come from the earth itself. Emma froze. It wasn't the wind. It was deeper, heavier. Mark's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto the farmhouse down the road. "Did you hear that?" Before Emma could answer, a sharp crack echoed across the fields, loud as a gunshot. It was followed by a tearing sound, like fabric ripping but magnified 1,000 times. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. She took a step toward the road, but Mark caught her arm. "Don't," he said, his grip firm. "Stay here." But she couldn't. She pulled away and ran toward the end of the driveway, Mark close behind. They reached the edge of the property just in time to see it. The roof of the farmhouse, the section over the front bedroom where she had planned to put Noah and Lily, was sagging visibly now, a dark depression against the sky. As they watched, the groan came again, louder this time, a scream of wood under intolerable pressure. Then, with a final heart-stopping crash, the roof caved in. Dust plumed into the moonlight, a grey cloud rising from the ruin. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood rolled over them, a violent final punctuation to the night. Emma stood paralyzed, her hands covering her mouth, her breath trapped in her throat. If they had been in there, if Mark hadn't been on the roof, if she had arrived 10 minutes later. Mark stood beside her, his face pale in the gloom. "My God," he whispered. "It really went." Emma trembled, the realization washing over her in cold waves. Her children, her babies. They would have been in that room. They would have been sleeping right under that beam. The poverty that had forced them here, the pride that had kept Will silent, the delay that had kept Mark away, it all culminated in this moment of terrifying clarity. They had survived by the grace of a stranger's guilt and a few minutes of timing. She turned to look back at the barn, where a warm light still glowed from the window. Noah and Lily were safe. They were sleeping, unaware that the roof they were supposed to be under was now a pile of debris on the floor of their future bedroom. "You saved them," Emma said, her voice shaking. She looked at Mark, really looked at him, and saw not just a stranger, but the man Will had trusted, the man who had finally, if belatedly, kept his promise. Mark shook his head, looking at the collapsed house with a mixture of horror and determination. "I didn't save the house," he said, "but I can help you rebuild it." Emma looked at the ruins of her home, then back at the barn where her children slept. She had lost her husband. She had almost lost her children. But as she stood in the cold night, listening to the dust settle, she realized something else. She wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in a long time, amidst the wreckage, she felt the faint, stubborn flicker of hope. The crack of the roof collapsing still echoed in Emma's ears, sharp as a gunshot in the silent night. She stared at the cloud of dust billowing from the house, a grey ghost rising against the moon. Her hands shook violently, not from the cold, but from the terrifying realization of what had just happened. If they had been inside, if she had ignored the stranger on the roof, if she had arrived 10 minutes earlier and put the kids to bed. The ifs tumbled through her mind like stones. Mark stood beside her, his face pale and grim in the faint light. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and blinked just in time. "My God," he whispered, his voice rough with shock. "It really went." Emma couldn't speak. She could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears. The violence of the collapse had been sudden and absolute. One moment, a house. The next, a ruin. The front bedroom, where Noah and Lily would have been sleeping, was gone, crushed under the weight of rotten beams and decades of neglect. The poverty that had forced them here, the pride that had kept Will silent, the delay that had kept Mark away. It all culminated in this pile of debris. They had survived by the grace of a stranger's guilt and a few minutes of timing. A low groan came from the house, the sound of wood settling into its new, broken shape. Mark took a step toward it, then stopped. "Stay back," he warned, his voice urgent. "The rest of the structure could be unstable." Emma grabbed his arm. "My things," she gasped, realizing suddenly. "The car keys, my purse, everything is in there." She had left her bag just inside the door when she ran out to confront him. Her entire life, what little was left of it, was buried under that rubble. Mark looked at her, his expression hardening with resolve. "I'll get them," he said. "You stay here with the kids." "No!" Emma cried, panic rising in her chest. "It's too dangerous, you said it yourself." "I know the house," Mark said, his voice calm but firm. "I know where the load-bearing walls are. I can get in and out before anything else shifts." He didn't wait for her permission. He turned and sprinted toward the ruin, disappearing into the dust cloud. Emma watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wanted to scream at him to come back, to tell him it wasn't worth it, but the words stuck in her throat. She looked back at the barn, where a warm light still glowed from the window. Noah and Lily were safe. They were sleeping, unaware that the roof they were supposed to be under was now a pile of debris on the floor of their future bedroom. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The house groaned again, a deep, ominous sound that vibrated through the ground. Emma held her breath, straining to see through the dust. "Mark!" she called out, her voice trembling. "Mark!" Silence. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, coughing and waving away the dust. Mark stumbled out, clutching her purse and a set of keys in one hand. He was covered in grey powder, and a thin line of blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, but he was alive. Emma ran to him, relief flooding through her so intensely it made her knees weak. "You idiot!" she sobbed, grabbing his arm. "You could have been killed." Mark leaned against the porch railing, catching his breath. He wiped the blood from his forehead with the back of his hand and offered her the purse. "I promised Will I'd look out for you," he said, his voice raspy. "I'm a little late, but I keep my promises." Emma took the bag, her hands shaking. Inside were her ID, the little cash she had left, and the only photo she had of Will and the kids together. It wasn't much, but it was everything. She looked at Mark, really looked at him, and saw not just a stranger, but the man Will had trusted, the man who had finally, if belatedly, kept his word. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate but sincere. Mark nodded, wincing as he shifted his weight. "We need to get you and the kids out of here," he said. "This structure isn't safe, even the parts still standing." "Where will we go?" Emma asked, the familiar panic rising again. The barn was a temporary fix, but they couldn't stay there forever. And with the house gone, they had nothing. Mark looked at the ruins of her home, then back at the barn. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Tonight you stay in the barn. Tomorrow we start rebuilding." Emma looked at the pile of rubble that had been her last hope. She had lost her husband. She had almost lost her children. She had lost her home. But as she stood in the cold night, listening to the dust settle, she realized something else. She wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, amidst the wreckage, she felt the faint, stubborn flicker of hope. Morning arrived not with the warmth of the sun, but with the harsh, revealing light of reality. Emma stepped out of the barn, shielding her eyes against the glare. The farmhouse sat across the yard, a wounded animal in the tall grass. In the daylight, the damage looked even more catastrophic than it had in the shadows of the previous night. The front section of the roof gaped open like a missing tooth, shingles scattered across the porch, the white siding streaked with dirt and debris. It was a monument to how close they had come to the end. Noah and Lily ran out past her, their resilience baffling and beautiful. They didn't see a ruin, they saw a construction site. They didn't see poverty, they saw an obstacle course. But Emma saw the impossible math. She had $17 in her purse and a house that needed thousands in repairs. The relief of survival began to curdle into the heavy, familiar dread of insolvency. Then she heard it. The low rumble of an engine grew louder, crunching over the gravel of the long driveway. Emma stiffened, her instinct to hide flaring up again. Had the county come to condemn the property? Had someone reported her for unfit living conditions? A battered pickup truck rounded the bend, followed by another, and then a third. They weren't official vehicles. They were muddy, rusted, working trucks loaded with lumber, ladders, and rolls of roofing felt. Mark drove the lead truck. He hopped out before the engine fully died, looking exhausted, but determined. He wasn't alone. 3 other men and a woman in coveralls climbed out of the other vehicles, carrying tool belts and thermoses of coffee. Emma walked to meet them, her hands smoothing her wrinkled shirt, trying to find some dignity in the dust. "Mark?" she asked, her voice failing her. "I made some calls," Mark said simply, unlatching the tailgate of his truck. He didn't look for praise. He looked at the house with the critical eye of a foreman. "Told folks Will's family was home and needed a hand. This is Sam, Dave, and Mrs. Higgins from the hardware store. She donated the shingles." The woman, Mrs. Higgins, nodded briskly. "Your husband fixed my generator during the blizzard of '22, she said, marching past Emma to inspect the porch. "Didn't charge me a dime. I don't forget things like that." Tears stung Emma's eyes, hot and fast. For months she had felt invisible, drowning in a system that didn't care if she sank. She had believed her poverty made her unworthy of notice. Now strangers were unloading wood in her yard, because Will had been kind when it mattered. The shame she had carried began to crack, letting light in. The day blurred into a symphony of noise and effort. The sound of hammers striking nails became a rhythm, a heartbeat for the dying house. There were no contracts signed, no money exchanged. It was the old economy, the one written in sweat and memory. Mark took charge of the roof, the very place that had terrified Emma the night before. He moved across the beams with confidence now, ripping out the rot, tossing the decayed wood down to the ground where the other men cleared it away. Emma worked alongside them, hauling debris, sweeping the porch, serving coffee that tasted like salvation. At one point she looked up to see Noah handing Mark a hammer. Mark paused, took it, and gave the boy a nod of respect. In that small exchange, Emma saw a gap being filled, not just the hole in the roof, but the hole in their lives, left by a father who had worked himself to death to protect them. By mid-afternoon, the structure was sound. Fresh yellow pine shone against the grey gloom of the old attic. The scent of sawdust, clean, sharp, and hopeful, replaced the smell of damp rot. The fear that had lived in the walls was being evicted, board by board. Mark climbed down as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the fields in gold. He wiped his face with a rag, his shirt dark with sweat. The roof wasn't pretty yet. It was patched and mismatched, but it was solid. It would hold snow. It would hold rain. It would hold a family. "It's secure," Mark said, taking a long drink of water. "We'll need to come back for the siding, but you can sleep inside tonight. The bedroom is safe." Safe. The word landed in Emma's chest and settled there. She looked at the house. It was still scarred, still old, still a project that would take years to finish. But it was standing. The injustice of their situation, the idea that money determined safety, had been fought back by something stronger. Community. "I don't know how to thank you," Emma said. "I can't pay you yet." Mark shook his head, looking toward the horizon where the first stars were appearing. "Will paid for this a long time ago," he said quietly. "We're just settling the account." That night, Emma made beds on the floor of the living room, deciding to give the fresh paint in the bedroom a day to cure. The house creaked as it cooled, but it wasn't the groan of collapse anymore. It was the settling of something being held together. Noah and Lily fell asleep instantly, exhausted by the excitement. Emma sat on the porch steps, watching the darkness claim the fields. The air was cold, but she didn't feel it. She felt the warmth of the day's work radiating from the wood beneath her. She thought of Will, not with the sharp, panic-induced grief of the last few months, but with a quiet sorrow. He had suffered in silence to keep this roof over their heads. He had been terrified of failing them. But looking at the sturdy patch on the roof, Emma realized he hadn't failed. He had built relationships that outlasted him. He had banked goodwill that saved them when cash couldn't. Mark had said the roof was rotten because it weathered the storms alone. People were the same. Emma understood now that independence was a myth for the rich. For the rest of them, survival was a team sport. She stood up and brushed the dust from her jeans. The future was still uncertain. There would be bills, there would be hard winters, and there would be lonely nights. But as she turned to go inside, locking the door behind her, Emma knew the truth. The man on the roof hadn't been an omen of death. He had been a messenger of a second chance. She had lost her husband, yes. The pain of that would never fully leave. But looking at her sleeping children, safe under a mended sky, she knew she hadn't lost the future. And for the first time since the funeral, Emma slept without dreaming of falling. If you were moved by Emma's journey and want to see more stories about resilience and hope, please subscribe to our channel. We need your help to reach 1,000 subscribers so we can continue bringing you these emotional tales. Click the subscribe button now. It's free for you, but it means everything to us.